Do that. Hello everyone, we're back again for a general election prediction video. This is the only prediction I will be doing of this cycle, as the election is on Tuesday and it is currently Sunday. I decided to do this video last minute after some consideration. I wasn't going to do a prediction this year, but then I decided to do one at the last minute after I saw some stuff that I wanted to discuss just heading into Tuesday. So the first thing I want to discuss is that this election is undeniably much different than 2020 and 2016. The biggest reason for that is this is the first presidential election where you can look at the polls and the betting odds and other aspects of the race, and you could say Donald Trump heading into the election is in a position to win. In 2016 and 2020, heading into those two elections, he was never on paper heading into those elections in a position to win. And the reason for that is because he was always down in the polls. Now, people that predicted Trump to win those elections were making those predictions based off of an assumption that there was going to be an error in the polls, or the assumption that certain pollsters were going to be right while other pollsters on the left were going to be wrong. In order for Trump to win this election, there doesn't have to be a polling error. It just would mean that certain polls that show him ahead are correct. Because if you look at the Real Clear Politics average in every swing state, they're all within the margins of error, and most of them have Trump winning. So there doesn't have to be a polling miss in order for Trump to win this election. He's also favored in several of the betting markets at the time that I'm making this video. And I know the betting markets aren't everything because they move on polls. And as we've seen, some questionable polls have come out over the last 24 hours. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video. The next thing I want to discuss before we get into the predictions are there are currently two sets of thought in the polls right now. There's the one side of the equation which has pretty much shown the same thing throughout the entire election, and that included when Biden was the Democrat nominee, and that is that Trump is ahead and that Trump is going to win. They haven't really adjusted the polls in Harris's direction at all after she took over as the nominee, and they've remained very consistent throughout the election. These polls include pollsters like Rasmussen, Atlas Intel, to an extent Trafalgar, although they've altered slightly, Emerson, and a few others, even in some states the New York Times. And then there's polls on the other end which show things like Harris +6, Harris +5, and these were much different than what we were seeing when Biden was the nominee. And people were questioning, how is it that the least popular vice president in the history of the United States managed to somehow poll so much better than Biden, and not only poll better than him, but managed to pull way ahead of Trump? And there were a lot of questionable aspects of those polls. A few of those polls, which have started to herd back towards the middle because they don't want to end up putting out something that's so crazy. Those polls included polls like Ipsos, the Morning Consult, although they now have Trump winning, but they had like Harris +6 as recently as last week, which is just insane. And then as recently as yesterday, you had the Selzer poll out of Iowa, which is considered the gold standard in Iowa, show Harris +3. And that just doesn't make any sense because there's been no campaign subs by either campaign in Iowa. If Harris were to win Iowa, it'd be the knockout blow to the Trump campaign. And in addition to that, the state has moved so far to the right after large Trump victories in 2016 and 2020 to the point where the Republicans have a massive edge on the Democrats in most aspects of that state and are currently ahead of the Democrats in the modeled early vote. Yet somehow that poll, which is considered the gold standard, has Harris ahead by 3. And that poll was also allegedly leaked to the Democrats before it came out, like a day before it came out. And on top of that, you have Emerson that comes out literally on the same day showing Trump ahead by, I think it was 10.5 points in Iowa, which is perfectly in line with what happened in Iowa in the prior two elections. And if you actually read the crosstabs of that poll, the poll makes sense. Selzer didn't publish her crosstabs, and the information about that poll that we have gotten has been really bizarre, to say the least. But with that, we will now go into the prediction of what I think is going to happen, taking both schools of thought into account when it comes to those differing polls that I've just discussed. So we're going to go west to east, and we're going to fill out the map based on what I think is going to happen. And we're going to start with the state of Nevada. Now, if you were around for my videos in 2016 and 2020, Nevada, I said at the time, was one of the hardest states to predict because it always looks like Republicans are able to win the state and then they always narrowly lose it. Now, the difference of Nevada in 2024 compared to the prior elections is that Nevada has continued its rightward trajectory that it's exhibited in 2016 through 2020, elected a Republican governor in 2022, and then almost elected a Republican senator as well in 2022, was one of the closest races in the country, and has since continued to show what appears to be trends to the right. Now, there's a few factors at play in this state because the polling has been anywhere from Harris +1 to Trump +6, and these are polls that have come out as recently as this week. The early vote numbers that we have out of Nevada, and that's a state that has a lot of voters that only vote early, which is a deviation from a lot of other states on this map and the way in which they vote, shows Republicans, because keep in mind these are modeled by party. It doesn't mean that it doesn't show which candidates received votes. It just shows which parties returned their ballots. These have shown that the Republicans have as of the point in time of this video, about a 40,000 vote lead, which is crazy because something like that has never happened in the state of Nevada in early vote where Republicans have a substantial lead. So if you're on the left and you want Harris to win Nevada, you're going to claim that once Vegas tabulates all of their votes in the Clark County area, it will end up being a Democrat advantage in the state, and that Harris will end up winning the state. And you would also have to say that the Republicans cannibalized their election day vote with the early vote. Now, that argument may be true, but that, from what I've seen, that does not appear to be true. It just, to me, looks like that the Republicans are overperforming in Nevada, and we still have the election day vote. So this is going to be a state that I'm going to turn to Trump. Although this is a state that might end up being the closest state of the election and could go either way. We'll know more about that state probably on Wednesday, if I had to guess, because of the way that the state counts. They do not count quickly, and we do know that they're going to be accepting ballots for 3 days, I think it's about 3 days after the election. And I believe those ballots still have to be postmarked for the day of the election. So there's honestly a really large chance that those outstanding ballots don't impact the outcome in the state, and honestly they probably won't unless it's really close, like less than a point. But if we're on Wednesday and Trump has a potential 1 to 3 point lead in the state, then those ballots aren't going to matter. So now let's go into Arizona. This state I'm just going to turn red to Trump, and the reason why is because if you look at what's going on in this state, not only is Trump ahead in the polls by pretty much every pollster with the exception of CNN in this state, the Republicans are ahead, last I checked, in the early vote by about 180,000. That's a big increase from where it's usually at for them. So that state looks just really, really hard for the Democrats to win right now. In addition to that, we don't see the either campaign, and when I say either campaign, I mean Donald Trump and Kamala Harris themselves, at this point making a serious play in this state. So what that shows me is that Trump wrapped up his rally up in Arizona towards the end of this week, and it doesn't seem like either campaign is going back there. So to me, what that shows is that both campaigns believe that that's going to be a state that goes to Trump, and that they're going to just basically concede that as a Trump win. Is it possible she wins that state? Yes, just not likely. So now let's do New Mexico. This is a state that I'm going to turn to Kamala Harris, although I do think it's going to be much closer than it was with Biden. And the reason for that is because the Trump campaign obviously has internal data that shows that that state is going to be closer, because Trump made a campaign stop there out of nowhere this past week. And I don't really think he'd be wasting time in a state that he didn't believe was going to potentially be closer. I don't think he'll flip it, but I do think it's going to be closer. And if a state like New Mexico is closer, that is a red flag for the trends we could be seeing in other parts of the nation for the Harris campaign, that is. So now we're going to go to Texas. This is going to be a Trump win. I expect him to win the state by anywhere between 5 and 10 points. There's been no serious play by the Harris campaign to win the state of Texas, which is a deviation from what we saw in 2020 and the beginning half of that campaign. Biden did make some plays at the state of Texas, although they didn't win it in 2020, so there's no reason to believe that since it's moved right, that Harris would have any chance of winning it. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to turn the Nebraska 2nd District to Harris, just because I don't want, this is another district that when you're rewarding your electoral votes on a proportional basis, we obviously know that Trump's going to win the state of Nebraska, but we don't have any evidence that says that she isn't going to win that district based on what we've seen so far. Now we're going to do the state of Iowa. Like I said, that Selzer poll is garbage. That's just what I'm going to leave it at. If Donald Trump loses the state of Iowa, I will delete my channel. So now we're going to go to the state of Minnesota. This is a state that has had polls that were, once again, are kind of all over the place. I've seen everything from Harris plus 10 to Harris plus 4. Anything under, I'd say a Harris plus 7 would be a red flag for the campaign, just because you have your running mate being the governor of that state, and it is much more left than the other Rust Belt states. So I'm going to turn that state to Harris, and I don't think Trump has a chance of winning Minnesota unless he well overperforms his expected vote share, basically on the national level. So this would have to be a popular vote win for Trump by about 2 to 3 points, I think, for him to pick off the state of Minnesota. So I'm going to skip the remaining Rust Belt states for now, and I'm going to move into New Hampshire and Virginia. So we'll start with New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a state that really wasn't thought of as being competitive up until very recently. When Biden was still the nominee after the debate disaster, there was some thought that Trump would win the state of New Hampshire, but that quickly kind of went away after Harris became the nominee, and there's been no real effort by the Trump campaign to win that state, except for literally today, because J.D. Vance is going there. And then we also saw that Harris surrogates have been spending some time in that state. I believe Joe Biden actually also campaigned for her in that state, and I know Bill Clinton did. So it's clear that there's something in the data in New Hampshire that is showing that state might be in play, or at least closer than what the polls were initially showing. There is another election up there where AI is ahead by about 3 points. She's expected to overperform Trump, but we're talking, if this is a big overperformance for her, it's not inconceivable that ends up carrying Trump over the line. And I'm not a believer necessarily in the reverse coattails, but if Republican turnout is much higher than expected, there's a really good chance they both end up winning. But there's not really any evidence of that right now. It could be close. It could be a Trump win, but I just don't see it right now. I'm going to turn that state to Harris. And now we're going to go down to Virginia. This is once again another state that was thought to be gone for Republicans. It looked close when Biden was the nominee after the debate disaster. Then it seemed like it went back to the left. However, the early vote data out of Virginia did show Republicans doing relatively well, more similar to the way that they performed during the 2021 election where Glenn Youngkin won. Is one of those states where under normal circumstances you would not expect Harris to lose. But it is a state that Biden won by 10 points. And if she is under that, let's say she wins it by 5, that is a huge underperformance for the Democrats in Virginia. Or let's say it is as close as some polls are saying, where it's maybe only a 3-point advantage for her. At the end of the day, I expect her to win it, but the data that we have right now suggests that state is going to be closer, and if there is a national overperformance by Trump, he might win that state. So now we're going to finish off the Sun Belt. Now, there's not really been there's some talk about North Carolina potentially being competitive, and that mainly derives from Trump's rally schedule that has had a heavy focus on that state. However, as recently as Monday, Harris has kind of pulled resources out of North Carolina and only decided to go back once she saw that Trump was spending so much time there, because they think that maybe they're spending time there because Trump's down and that he may not actually win the state. There is not a lot of polling data that suggests that Harris is ahead in North Carolina, aside from the New York Times poll, which came out today, that has her up by, I think, 2 or 3 points. But at the same time, Nate Cohn, who runs that poll, also released a statement saying that white Republican voters have been hard to reach in their samples, which is a pretty big deal. So if you're not able to reach those voters, saying Harris is up by 2 could mean she's actually down by like 4. So that's really the only poll right now that has her ahead that you could consider a reputable pollster, if you even consider New York Times to be a reputable pollster. And the early vote, once again, Republicans are ahead in the early vote. So the only way that Harris would be able to win this state is if a substantial amount of Republicans are voting for her, or the independent vote is so lopsided in her favor, and there's no evidence of that considering most polls show Trump winning independents. So with regards to Trump's rally schedule focusing so much on North Carolina, what I think that is more about is because they view their best path as a Sunbelt sweep plus Pennsylvania. And then anything else in addition to that is a bonus for them. So if the polls show North Carolina being the closest Sunbelt state, it makes sense to lock that down and then lock down Pennsylvania. So focus all your resources on locking down North Carolina and Pennsylvania, which it appears Trump is currently doing, which would eliminate Harris. If Harris doesn't have a chance in Georgia, if you believe that she doesn't have a chance in Georgia, she'd have to win North Carolina. And if you lock down North Carolina, then she's boxed into the 3 Rust Belt states. So I think Trump's going to win North Carolina. I think it's going to be between 2 and 4 points. Like I said, there's a chance Harris wins it, but it's not the most likely outcome, in my opinion. So now we're going to do Georgia. So yesterday there was a lot of panic over Georgia because they had this thing where they were going to keep accepting votes in the Atlanta area on Saturday, even though that was against the law. The Republican Party quickly sued, and the Democrats conceded that they would allow the Republican poll watchers to observe this count, which does provide a lot of transparency, and you can actually analyze the ballots coming in and make sure they are legitimate. And then in addition to that, Gwinnett County also just dropped the idea entirely, so that didn't happen. And this is another state where we're seeing in the rural areas, there is higher turnout than in the urban areas. So what that likely shows is Trump is running up the score in areas where he's favored. And keep in mind, there is no, in terms of the early vote, there's no returns that are by party. So you have to go based on the geography of where the ballots are being returned from. So you're seeing the early returns heavy in the rural areas, and the Democrats lagging a little bit in the Atlanta area, and that's probably due to lower black turnout. And there is an expectation that black male turnout is going to be higher for Trump than it's been in any of the prior elections, and the black turnout in general is expected to be higher for Trump than in the other 2 elections. So based off of that, I'm going to give Georgia to Trump. And this is where the map starts to get really small. And this is because in this scenario, Harris has to win all 3 Rust Belt states to win. Trump only needs to win 1. This is why I said the Sun Belt is locking down the Sun Belt. You don't campaign in North Carolina as heavily as Trump is because you think you're losing North Carolina. It's because if that's the closest of the Sun Belt states, you want it locked down because you box her into one electoral path if you lock that down. And don't take my word for it. Mark Halperin, who I'm not the biggest fan of, I think he's a little bit of a fence sitter, has also said that his sources on both sides don't believe that Harris has a path in the Sun Belt. And one thing I will say about Mark Halperin, although I disagree with him on his certain views of his, is that he's been right about basically everything he's said so far in this election. He said that on the Thursday of the RNC, he said Biden was going to drop out over the weekend. Everyone called him crazy, and he was right. Almost everything he said about this election has been true, and that's probably because he has sources on both sides. So when he says he talks to Republican and Democrat sources, and both say that they don't think Harris is going to win the Sun Belt, I tend to believe that as well. So now we're going to go into the Rust Belt. Now, the common idea of the Rust Belt, or what has been the common idea of the Rust Belt this entire election, is that Pennsylvania is going to decide the election, and it might, but I view things a little bit differently. I think that the state of Wisconsin is actually the state that's going to decide the election, and the reason for that is historically, if you look at the last two elections and the midterms, Wisconsin usually is the state where Trump's most underestimated in, and in addition to that, it's the state that counts the fastest out of these three, typically. So if you're in a situation where Pennsylvania is going back and forth, and you don't really have an idea who won Michigan, Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania, odds are Wisconsin's going to be the first one that gets all the votes in. Now, we've seen the polls basically be 50-50 here. You'll get a Harris +1, a Trump +1, a Trump +2, Harris +2. So there's not really any sort of polling that is going one way or the other in this state, but we do know that it severely underestimates Trump. Typically, the polling in the state underestimates Trump, and underestimates Trump significantly. In addition to that, Mark Halperin, in the same analysis where he discussed the Sun Belt, also said that in the state of Wisconsin, his sources on both sides said that they would be shocked or surprised if Harris won the state of Wisconsin. And once again, this is reflected in the campaign schedules. Trump wrapped up his operations in Wisconsin from his personal perspective of him being there on Friday. J.D. Vance is still going to be hanging in Wisconsin occasionally, doing events there, and so are his surrogates. But Trump himself is not visiting Wisconsin again. If Trump actually believes he's ahead in Wisconsin, and Mark Halperin's right, that actually makes sense. And we saw Obama in Milwaukee. So if Harris is lagging in the urban areas, especially among minorities, it would make sense to send Obama into Milwaukee. So coupled with the polling, which is basically 50-50, and you're seeing what Halperin says, and they have Obama in Milwaukee, to me that shows that they believe that this state they're potentially in trouble in this state. And for that reason, I think that is going to be the state that tips the scale, and that's going to be the state where when it's called for Trump, we're going to know that Trump won the election. But what's going to end up happening is that I believe that this is going to be the state that falls. This is going to be like what Arizona was in 2020, where Trump was pretty much ahead nationwide, and then the doubt started to creep in when Arizona was called for Biden early on in the night. There was issues with that call, but I think that this is going to be the state that it's where the election is going to maybe look like it's really close all night, and then you're going to get to like midnight, and then someone's going to call Wisconsin for Trump, and then whatever happens after that happens, but you're going to know that Trump probably won the election. So now let's go into Pennsylvania. The state of Pennsylvania is looking like it's going to be extremely close. The Democrats had a goal of building up a firewall. Well, they've actually fluctuated the goal of how they wanted to build up the firewall of early votes. First, it started out that they wanted to build up a firewall of around 750,000 votes. They realized they weren't going to get that because, one, the Republican turnout was higher, and this is largely due to low propensity voters and Republicans embracing the early vote system. It's now been revised down to 500,000. That doesn't look like they're going to hit that either. And now it's down to 450,000. So they just keep moving the goalposts on the early vote numbers there. So based on what we're seeing in the early vote, the expectation would be that if Trump can win the election day vote by 10 points or more, he's probably going to win the state. Now, that is not that big of a lift to say that you only need to win 10% of the election day votes in the state of Pennsylvania. That would actually be an underperformance from where Republicans typically perform. So we're being generous to the Harris campaign at that point by saying that it has to be 10 10 points, like only 10 points. So there's a chance that it's way over 10 points, and in the state's not even close. Almost all of the reliable polls that have gauged Pennsylvania correctly in the past show Trump ahead by 1 to 2 points. And so you couple the polls with the early vote. It's undeniable, in my opinion, that Trump has an advantage in the state of Pennsylvania currently. Doesn't mean she can't win, but it would be you'd have to jump through some hoops here to say that Harris is in a better position in Pennsylvania right now. Could there be a massive Republican underperformance on Election Day? There could be, but there's no evidence that that's going to happen. So we're going to turn Pennsylvania to Trump, and at this point, he's well above the 270 margin to win the election. So now it comes down to the state of Michigan, which at this point isn't going to be a deciding factor in the election. I do believe that this is the hardest state in the Rust Belt for a Republican to win. Now, logic would suggest that you turned Wisconsin and Pennsylvania red, therefore you should turn Michigan red because these states have voted together in every election since 1988. 1988 was the last time that these states did not vote together, and I believe that was because Dukakis somehow managed to win Wisconsin despite losing pretty handily nationwide. Now, this state is going to be extremely close. It's more liberal than the other two, and is definitely the hardest for Trump to win. The things that he has working in his favor in this state are the demographics of the working class voters that are likely going to carry him to victory in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Those voters are inside of this state as well, and there's a new factor in the state. The Muslim and Arab population of this state is significant and would account for Biden's entire margin of victory in the state in 2020. We know that those voters are probably not going to turn out in substantial numbers for Harris. We know that based on their own sentiment of what they've said, and the fact that you have that one Democratic mayor in the state that actually endorsed Trump, and a lot of Muslim and Arab leaders in the state also endorsed Trump, which has never happened before. So there's a good chance a lot of those voters end up voting for Trump, or they just don't vote at all, or they vote third party. Either of those hurts Harris. Now, what Harris has working in her favor is, like I said, this is technically the most liberal of these three Rust Belt states. So it's possible that she loses Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, but still manages to hang on in Michigan. I think this will be the closest state of these three. I think it'll be within a point or less in either direction. That's my official prediction on the state. And what I will do, just because of the way that I think the state's going to perform, there's not a whole lot of data one way or the other. You have polls showing her ahead. You have polls showing him ahead. Right now on the RCP average, she's ahead by about half a point. I'm going to ride with the RCP average on this state. I'm going to say that Harris wins the state between a half a point and a point. And that's my official general election prediction, 297 to 241. The difference here would be that this state goes to Trump and the Rust Belt trend continues where the three states vote together. I think Harris has the upper hand in Michigan, although it is a small upper hand in Michigan. Now, in this scenario, you could see a lot of different things happen in terms of the popular vote. This is going to be the only election that Trump runs in where he has a chance to win the popular vote. The popular vote right now is showing the race anywhere from Harris +3 to Trump +3. The recent polls that have come out, like the most recent polls that have come out, are leaning more towards a 50-50 race to a Trump +1 to 2. Those include Atlas Intel, which was the most accurate pollster in 2020. I don't want to hear anyone say that Atlas Intel is a right-wing pollster because they were spot on in 2020. They were spot on in 2022. Then you have Rasmussen, which does lean a little more to the right. They have Trump ahead by between 2 and 3 points, but they've shown that throughout the entire election. You have Wall Street Journal, Trump ahead by 3. Fox News, which is a pretty left-wing pollster, despite being considered a right-wing network. Fox is a pretty left-wing pollster. They have Trump +2. Then you have a lot of Harris +1s. These are like the YouGovs. Even Morning Consult is now, I think, only Harris +2. In this scenario, you're probably looking at anywhere from a Harris +1 popular vote win to a Trump +1 popular vote win. And I'm not saying that it can't be any more in one way or the other, but the reality is Harris has to win the popular vote by more than 2 points, most likely to win the to win the Electoral College, just because of how the Electoral College works. So this is my official prediction. I will not be doing another prediction for the election. This is the final one. I'd like to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see what happens. Keep it civil in the comments. Thank you.